So good morning, everyone, and greetings from Costa Rica. Two of us are in Costa Rica. Dr. Lai Sayakong from the University of Costa Rica and I are now giving our presentations from outside of the United States. So this is really the Chinese American experience and beyond, and I think we're kind of on the beyond part of it. I wish to thank Lily and Dr. Stein for inviting me to share my adventure of finding my Chinese roots and our family tree, because it is very difficult to do that if you do neither read nor speak Chinese. I was born into an immigrant family, and it is almost impossible to learn to read Chinese overseas, as those of us who are members of the diaspora know, and most of us have an immigrant backgrounds at some point or another. So I know that a lot of you are familiar with how it works when you lose your language and your original family stories. I also want to thank Dr. Rubenstein, my Wellesley friend, and to Lai Sai for their collaboration and participation in this presentation. So I welcome you to my story. And I do want to warn you first that due to the lack of Chinese language spoken and written, I have had to use other substitutes. So I have made up tools, words, and anything that I can get my hands on in order to understand and discover this difficult part of my Chinese history. I also want to warn you that since I do not speak Chinese, I will be saying some Chinese words. The accent is terrible. Do not try to correct me. For those of you who speak Chinese, it really doesn't make any difference. I hope you will understand it as we all do overseas. The letters on the screen will sometimes be very small. Don't worry about that. I just want you to see the general pattern of how the information is organized. And when we need to have an enlargement and show you a detail, Muteng will help me by showing an additional slide. Questions will be taken at the end of the presentation. And I just want to check that everybody can hear me. Do we have any problems on that end?
No.
Okay, great. So the first things, I'm going to divide this lecture into 5 parts. The first one, I'll introduce my family in Costa Rica quickly. Then we were going to talk about how to recover your Chinese name and birthplace written in Chinese, which is the first barrier. I'm going to be speaking to you about something called the generational poem, which is something that I think exists only in China, and also about the Zupu or family tree manuscript. And at the end, I will give you different sources of information which I have used to get to our family tree. Next slide, please. So this is a photograph of my family in Costa Rica taken in 2003 in front of the building of the Supreme Court of Costa Rica. There are 150 members of the family there, of my father and my mother. That's half of the 300 members that currently live in Costa Rica. We are all related, but we don't know how. And I'll give you their names and numbers on the next page, please. So this page is an attempt to register the names of the 150 persons on that photograph. And as you can see, we tried to write in the Chinese names, and we were not all of it successful, but we tried. So this gave rise to the question, how are all these people related? And in the next pages, we will try to develop that process. And I will tell you this is to start with my family. So this is a picture of my father, Ambassador Luis Huachong, at a reception hosted by Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek in 1969 in Taipei. My father is the second from the right, and Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek is in the middle, and he is toasting my father. And of course, to us, it was a great honor to have him in a photograph with such an enormously complex and important man. Next slide, please. This is a picture of my official portrait as ambassador of Costa Rica to the Republic of China on Taiwan. As you can see on the bottom business card, it is in English, and we can all read it over here. But on the side and perpendicular is my Chinese business card, which has 4 words, and I cannot read those. The only word I recognize is the little one on the top, and that will be my family name, which is Liu, which is the same name that is behind me in the poster right here in the back. I have written the glyph, the name, 2 ways of spelling it, L-E-E, Li, and Liu, which is L-U umlaut, which is a different way of spelling the same name. Next slide, please. This one is a picture of the Wellesley Club of Costa Rica when Hillary Clinton was First Lady and she visited Costa Rica in 1979. And this, of course, is my very grateful picture of a wonderful occasion to host her in Costa Rica. Now we're going to talk about the history and family tree of the rest of the family. Next slide, please. So I know you can't read it, but I want you just to see the general format. It is a family tree. Each rectangle represents a male. The Chinese keep track only of the male line. And of course, each rectangle is the son of somebody else above it. This particular diagram goes from 1644 down to the year about 2000. It goes from generation 86 to generation 102. If you notice the 4 columns on the left side, one column will have the number of the generation, 86 to 102. The next column will have the Chinese glyph of that generation. The next column will have the pronunciation in pinyin. And then it will have a year, which is an approximate year of when I think those generations were alive. So this is what we want to get to, how the picture of the 150 people connect to this diagram. On the bottom right, there are 4 small squares, and those are the 4 Ka brothers of my grandparents' generation. 4 of them came to Costa Rica, and our entire family in Costa Rica descends from the bottom half of that diagram. So we do have a common ancestor according to the records I will be showing you. How we got this information is what I am next going to explain. We are going to start, next page, please. So on this diagram, we will see that all the family members in Costa Rica are related. We have one common ancestor. We found his name, where he was born, and the date. We know the generation that left China was generation 97. And that is where our problems begin, because once our Chinese language is lost, all history is lost. We cannot read or write Chinese. And we also will answer the question of how far back we can go with written records. And the answer is to around 400 BC. Next slide, please. We are going to deal with the first few barriers to recovering your Chinese family tree. The first one is the language barrier, and that is we need to find out what our Chinese name in Chinese glyph. We need to find our birth town. We need to find our ethnic group. Next slide, please. And then we will deal and try to explain to you the language problem and romanization, of which there are 2 versions, the wave shield system and the pinyin more recent system. So let us start. Next stage, please. So in this chart, I am using it to try to explain to you the differences in just the family name between the Western alphabet, the Chinese glyph, and romanization. The Chinese always do things differently. So for example, in column 1, I am writing down there the Western way to write your name. And your name in Western style is written your first name, your middle name, and then your family name. To the right, the Chinese way of writing your name is First, it's your family surname, then your generational name, and eventually your first name. Further on the right, when you reach romanization, because we will try to go from the Chinese glyph to an acceptable, standardized, romanized way of writing it, we will go back to writing our name in first name, generational name, and family name. So as an example, my father's name is Luis Huachang. So when he landed in Costa Rica, the immigration officer, as most of us immigrants over here in America did, they asked him his name and he said, Luis Huachang. So the immigration officer in 1900 wrote down Luis Huachang in Spanish, which was the best he could do. So several years later, after my father learned Spanish, he looked at his name and he said, my gosh, they dropped my family name. So he did not wish to lose his family name, which is at the time written L-E-E. So he added it on back to the name and he ended up being Luis Huachang Lee. So all of us who have landed in America probably have some change in our names. And he eventually became known as either Mr. Hua or Mr. Chang or Mr. Lee, and sometimes Senor Lee. So it becomes difficult even in the West to figure out if all these people are the same person. Finally, I'm going to refer to the fact that there are also royal or noble titles, and my father could be addressed as Your Excellency of Ambassador, because we will need these titles when we move further on and deal with the internet. So in the middle column, we now have the Chinese script, and it is in brush strokes down the middle. It's in a large size, so you can see it. The way my father described it to me is there are two hungry mouths with chopsticks joining them. Apparently the Chinese, to describe how to write, identify a glyph, will make this kind of description, and that is the way I have always been able to remember them. Beneath that larger glyph are two printed ways to write Yu, and one is called a simplified printed image, and the other one is a traditional image. And the difference I can see is it has one stroke less because the Chinese have been trying to simplify their language. The equivalent to a noble or royal title in the Chinese case would be Duke Huan of Qi. And I bring it up because we will see it later on. Now we're going to the Romanization column. And in that column number 3, I have written down the two systems that are most commonly used. In the Wayne-Gill system, which was developed by the British around 1870, our family name would be written L-E-E. 1 century later, in the Pinyin official system accepted by the Chinese government, it would be spelled L-U with 2 dots at the top, the umlaut. Those are important because the way to access the internet today, you will need the Pinyin version. On the next set of blocks, I have written other ways of writing the same glyph, because if you are in Vietnam or in Singapore or some other country, our name could also be alphabetized into L-O-I, L-V, L-A-I, or L-U. So you have to be very flexible when you're dealing with all of these names. The equivalent nobility or royalty name would be, for example, the Duke of Cambridge, which I believe is William, Prince of Wales. Now, we've gone through the Western alphabet, the Chinese, and Romanization. Now we'll get to the next page. And we're going to tackle the birthplace problem. In our case, we have found out that our family arises from the north of China in a place named Shandong, somewhere around 200 BC. They eventually moved south and took the name Li from a lake that existed in their territory that was granted to them. So in fact, the state of Liu, spelled L-U with that glyph, gave origin to our current name. In the middle column, we are now living with a hometown is now in South Canton, and it is called Hoxan. Depending on whether you are using Romanized or Pinyin, we will spell it and pronounce it a little differently, but it is the same city. It is in the nearabouts of Jiangmen City, and you can see down below how it is written in glyph. It is in the province of Canton, near the town capital city of Guangzhou, and it can be spelled Canton in Weijil or Guangdong in Pinyin. Further to the right on the third column, we have our ethnic and language group, which is a Hakka. We are a group called the Han Hakka, which arose in the middle valley between the rivers. In Pinyin, the name is spelled and spoken as Koja, and in Weijil, it is Hijia. This in English translates to guest. So apparently this is a group of family who came from the from the north, and were guests in the south and simply stays. So to summarize at the bottom, the name of the town today is in that Chinese glyph. It would be romanced in Weijil as Canton Hoxan, and in Pinyin Mandarin as Heshan. Good. Now we're going to tackle the this is the birthplace issue. Next place, please. Now we're going to tackle something called the generational poem. And the generational poem is a name that every Chinese male has. Each male has a generational poem and is a concept or ideal. It is not an object. Decided, the generational names are decided by the head of household. I have a mistake there. It is 16 names, not 18 names. So the head of household decides 16 names with a specific pattern that are the names that will be christened in the next 16 generations, and which I call a poem. The way this arises is because Uncle Alfredo, who was 90 years old, told me that he knew how to write his name and his father's name and his grandfather's name. So he wrote them in a piece of paper, and he said that is all that he remembered. So some years later, I kept asking different family members about our family tree. And then my cousin Manuel eventually understood that these names had a pattern. And he said, oh, my uncle Antonio, before he left for China 25 years ago, gave me a piece of paper, and he told me to save it because it was a very important piece. So I put it in a book and I forgot about it. So I asked him to find it, and a few years later, he came up with that paper, and there were in fact 16 names in it. That is what I call the generational family poem. My other friend, Francis Shimo, who is from Taiwan, wrote it in a typewriter so that I could work with it, and I call it a double octagram set. It is the generational family poem, which covers 500 years in those 16 names. And every family has a unique pattern. Next page, please. So this is what I call the family poem. It is a double octagram. I know it is very small, but we will show you the important things later. I just want you to notice the general pattern. This one has 4 columns. So on the far right is the number of the generation. It has the name in Pinyin and the glyph. So it's generation 91, 92, down to 98. The next column to the right gives you the pronunciation in Mandarin and Cantonese and its meaning in Spanish and English. And when I am able to find it, about the approximate dates in which those people lived. Over on the right of this page, on the far right corner, are generations 98 down to 106. So this family poem has 16 generations from 91 to 106. And they cover the years approximately 1800 to 2020. We're going to watch an enlargement now. Next page, please. So this enlargement shows us 3 generations, 91 Qing, 92 Qing, and 93 Wen. That's important because generation 93 will be our common ancestor, our first common ancestor generation. As you can see in that 93 generation, we have the pronunciation in Cantonese, in Mandarin, Wen. It means elegance in Spanish or literature, and also that in English. And this is around 1800. The next few pages enlarge the similar generation. So this is generation Ka, which is my grandfather's generation. It has the names of the 4 brothers in Chinese and in Spanish. And it tells you that that generation are either siblings or cousins, and they are related by a same father or uncle. Generation 98 is my father's generation with the same pattern. They are either brothers or cousins. So the next generation, the next page, please. This is generation 99, which is my generation Sun. It has the dates 1920 to 2000, which are approximate. And we have now reached generation 100, which is the glyph of the youngest generation in Costa Rica. Can we see the next chart, please? Okay, this is repeated, so let's go past that. Skip the next one. Skip the next one. Skip the next one. And we are now that we've finished with explaining to you the family poem, we will introduce to you a new manuscript. So this is a Zupu or Jaipu, and it is a Chinese family millennial manuscript. It is a handwritten record or family tree from China, which was sent to us by a cousin. It has the name of every male in the household. It is a manuscript which shows the family history, and it will tell us that our ancestral name is Zhang, our family name is Liu, our birthplace is also named Liu, and it is taken from a territory. And then it will give us dates related to the birth or reign of an emperor. I am going to show you parts of a manuscript so that you can see what it looks like. Next page, please. So this is a photograph of a Supu manuscript. These are copies, of course, these are not original. And this is the Supu of a friend, Mr. Rogelio Chin in Costa Rica. And I show it because he is the descendant of a military governor of Guangdong. You can see by the brush strokes that they are very even, proportionate, very clear, and very beautiful. So it is an easy document to read. Not all Zupus are as clear as this one. I'm next going to show you the front page of our family Zupu. Thank you. So this Zupu has 53 pages. It is written around 200 BC about the family history starting in 600 and ends about 2015. This cover page, the only word I can read is the first one, which is again, excuse me, our Liu family glyph. Many Zupus did not survive because of the Cultural Revolution. That was the decade of 1966 to 76, when the government or cultural, led by the Cultural Gang of Four, were trying to make disrupted family tradition of honoring their ancestors in order to make them more loyal to the government. So we were able to recover ours by a cousin named Daquan Liu, who sent it to us from China. But the reason he sent it to us from China is that I had recovered the family poem in Costa Rica, had sent copies to China, So when they received it, they realized who was related to whom, and one of them found their zupu and made a copy which he sent to me. We are now going to look to our family zupu. Next page, please. So this is page 39 of our family manuscript. I want to show you, you can't read it, but I will want to show you a few important details. On top of the page will be the number 89. Next to it will be 90 and 91. So this tells you that this is generations 89, generation 90 and 91. The number 39 is at the bottom so that I can identify that on this page is the family poem. On the left side of that page, you can see that there are 8 names in a vertical row next to another one. So this is a double octagram. Most of these documents have been translated by Mr. Francis Shimo, Ana, and Martin. It is very difficult to read because it has Chinese written at different times. So you have to be very highly educated. You have to know different sets of Chinese of times in order to be able to read this document. So here's an enlargement of the family zupu, and you can see that they are 2 double octograms. I want you to notice that the top right of that octagram has the glyph for ting. Excuse me. So this shows you that our family poem is incorporated on page 39 of our family zupu. So the zupu is in the next page. So here's an enlargement with the ting glyph on the right. And next we will look at the poem. Next page, please. Right, and this is the same poem that we saw, and on the right column, there will be number 91, generation ting. That's just to confirm that our Chinese family poem is the same as that on page 39 of the manuscript. Thank you. Excuse me a second. Good. Oh, so now next page, please. So now we know our name, our birthplace, hometown, the name of 16 generations, and we have the family tree zupu with 106 generations. So the next problem is, what do we do with the zupu? Well, you get a lot of help. So the first help I got was to ask somebody to transfer 29 of those names into a table. I used four pieces of paper to write 25 names for table in an enlarged form so that I could work with them. This was done by Mr. Chow, and I will tell you about him in a minute. So each box will include a Chinese glyph, a generational name, dates. It will have the name of the emperor, the dynasty, and the Gregorian calendar equivalent. We will try to match the most recent generations to the family poem, one by one, and then we will match the earliest generations to epic China. Before we go on, I would like to tell you how we did this. Next page, please. Now, Mr. Chow is not a direct blood descendant. He is the father-in-law of one of my nieces. So Mr. Chow is the one who did this work. These are 25 glyphs on one page. In this page, I put the glyphs of generations 75 to 100 and enlarged the glyph and put in the names of the family members in Costa Rica who are there. So we know that these 16 generations in this chart are equivalent to those that are in the zupu. These are generations 76 to 100. Now we are going to look at the next page, which is the enlarged generational names of generations 1 to 25. These were harder to deal with because that's talking about 600 BC to 200 AD. And here comes a story of how a stranger can help you. I wander around with these pieces of paper to try to make sense out of them and ask anybody I find if they can help. So I was visiting my niece Lorena in Houston. She is married to Dr. Jimmy Chow, who is a chemist. And Jimmy Chow graduated from the University of Costa Rica. Jimmy Chow's friend from Costa Rica, who was a white Costa Rican, ended up living in Hainan and married a Chinese lady. So this friend and his wife were visiting Jimmy Chow in Houston and having dinner there. And when I met her, she looked like a very westernized and educated woman. So I showed her these pages and I said, you know, maybe you could help me read these words. And I said, for example, maybe you could help me read box number 12. And box number 12 says in Chinese glyph and in pinyin, Xiao Bai. And please notice that there's another box 11 on top of it, and that says Liu Pu. So when I asked this lady to help me, she said, oh yes, I know Mr. Xiao Bao. He's very famous. He's in movies and there's books written about him and he's on TV. And I said, oh, well, that's great. Do you think you could find him for me on internet? So the next page will show you what she found. And here is the enlarged glyphs and names of generations 11, Liu Pu, and 12, Xiao Bai. And this is what Jimmy Chow's wife's friend was trying to locate for me on internet. So let's see if she succeeded. Next page, please. Okay, so if we go into internet, you will see this page. I'm going to read it quickly. And this is the Duke Huan of Qi. He reigned around 600. He died in 643. It will give us his predecessor, his successor, his spouses, his children. And at the bottom, it will give us his ancestral name, Jiang, and his clan name, Liu, and his given name, Xiao Bai. It will also tell us who his father and mother were. So instead of looking at the next page, we are going to shortcut and look at the link. Perhaps, Muting, you could click on the link so we can access the internet. Is that possible? Well, maybe not. So if you were on the internet, you could read that this is the story of Duke Huan of Qi, who he married, what time it happened, who he killed or who he poisoned, and whether he was a good ruler or not a good ruler. In this particular case, it says Duke Huan of Qi completely lost its predominance after he died. So that's, after that event, I decided that if we could look up generation 12, we could probably look up generation 11. And so I looked up, next slide, please, Duke Shi of Qi. Now we're going to try it here again. This will tell us the year he was born, he ruled, his parents, his wives, his children, and it will tell us that his ancestral name is Jiang, his clan name is Liu, and his given name is Liu Fu. This differs a little bit from the name in my box because mine was Liu Pu. But no matter how it's pronounced in Romanized version, the important thing is that the Chinese glyphs coincide. And in fact, they do. I wonder, Muting, if we can get into the link or not. Should we try it once more? I guess not. So we'll just look at the next page. And this is the story of the Duke Shi of Qi. So it also tells you his story, and as we have developed our process, you can now understand that this seems to be our 11th generation ancestor. So, summary, next page, please. We have now found the Lee family diagram from generation 1 and the name to Costa Rica. We have shown that generation 96 in the front of the lecture shows all of the Lee family members descend from one elder brother who himself has another elder ancestor around generation 86 in 1700. And we know we can trace it back to generation 11 to 12. Next slide, please. So the access to internet gives us written records, which are available in English and Spanish and French, thankfully. The diagram that we looked at to start was from 1642, near the fall of the Ming Empire, to the current time, and we identified the common ancestors. So we now know that elder brother of Wen Feng was born around 1800, and he was generation 93. Next slide, please. I am going to tell you about different sources of information very quickly. So in China, one of them is the family ancestral shrine. These are important because these are family temples, and the name of each male is written in a tablet, which is put into the shrine. So if you cannot find your Chinese family manuscript, you can certainly take a picture of it, and with someone who reads Chinese, or you write the association, you can figure out what the line of descent is of all your family members. Next page, please. This is a family ancestral tomb, which is also important because there you will have the names, the dates, and the locations of your family. Next page, please. So to summarize the Western sources of information, you use family letters or photographs, you chat to clan members, you speak to business associations, benevolent associations, township ancestors. Thankfully, Chinese tend to congregate around their language and ethnic group, so the township associations will know somebody in your family and have the same name, so you can look them up. You can also look up courthouses. My great-grandfather in Costa Rica was caught having adulterated liquor, and so he was fined for contraband, so I have a court record of that. You can go to DMV records, municipal health offices, and registrars or police stations. Next page, please. So internet sources in China. Of this list, you can look every one of those up, but the most important one that I think would be the most useful is the first one, 400 most common names in China, and there's the link. And if you pop that up, you will find that your name is probably in there. In this list, my name, Liu, is number 47 on that list. And it says the English, the Spanish, the Romanized versions. So it provides a way to get information from internet. I think that's the end of the sources on China. So the last slide, and before I close, and we start the question and answer section, I would like to thank the audience for the interest, and each of you, especially Elizabeth,